I'd like to welcome back Jane and Marlene and Loretta to a panel discussion which is going to last for 30 minutes. And also I want to introduce Christine Young. Christine Young is the chair of the Local Government Professionals Age-Friendly Communities Network, and when she's not doing that, she's also the Director of Community Development at the City of Melville, and with decades of experience working in both community services, community development in local government and community organisations. This is a free-for-all, well, in the most polite of fashions. So those of you that didn't get a chance to ask Loretta or Katrina or Marlene questions, this is the opportunity to do so, and we'll look at this, one each. Isn't that fabulous? Yell if you have to wake them up. So you've all got mics, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Look, thank you very much, Andrew. And what sensational films. Let's just sort of in absentia of the winners once again. So as Andrew said, this is a free-for-all. I don't know what that means, but... right, good, okay, right, okay. So questions from the floor, otherwise I'm going to ask the questions. So, and if you're asking questions, can you just say who you are and where you're from? That could be... Sorry? Stand. Who's doing the job? Thanks, I've got the suggestion. Andrew said stand up, all right? So we've got that. So any questions or will I kick it off? Oh, I kick it, all right, okay, I kick it off. One of my questions was around, it was to Katrina, but perhaps Katrina can stand up too. I was really interested to know whether older adults were interviewed in the evaluation. You talked about, you know, surveys and local government, and I'm picking up on the comment about where are older people in these discussions.
That's a really good question. We did not include any older adults, older residents of local government areas in this evaluation. I think because our primary focus was on the process of how local government officers have engaged with the age-friendly methodology and the toolkit that you were supplied with as part of the grants programme activities. So that was the primary focus. But you're quite right, extending that conversation to older adults living in those communities would be a great way of adding more evidence and engaging them in the conversation.
Look, you're quite right. You're actually evaluating the process, and I think what I'm interested in addition, is how do we measure impact? Because it's just so jolly complicated.
You're absolutely right, and I think because we're now at this stage, establishing ways of baselining data and measuring it and telling the good news stories. There are so many great examples, qualitative data of amazing things that are happening in communities all over WA. I think it's more about gathering those and presenting them as as evidence of improvements.
Perhaps I can take that thought and go to Christine and say, okay, well, you're chair of this group. Are there discussions about what data is being gathered? And, you know, Katrina, you made a good point about standardisation of how do we gather this data and what does it look like. Has there been any discussions, Christine, about that?
There haven't been specific discussions around that, and I think it's a great topic for the network actually to look at around how we evaluate and how we measure the impact of the work that we're doing. I think largely our work to date has been, I guess, gathering that shared understanding of what age-friendly communities work is about, having a place where people can come together to share the challenges from their perspective in terms of the work that they do in their own local governments. Engagement practices have been really important, and we've looked at a whole, I guess, range of mechanisms of how people engage to get that data that informs the research that then in turn informs the strategic planning or the age-friendly planning that communities do.
Okay. Questions? Yes. Name, stand up, where are you from?
If I stand up, I'll block other people, so I'll just sit. My name's Cecilia Broderick. I'm from the Department of Mines, Industry, Regulation and Safety. But
that's a new department.
It is, just consumer protection.
So it'll roll off your tongue sometime soon.
Eventually, yes, it will. My question's really and it goes to the topic you were just talking to about the involvement of participants in the data that's collected. Really interested, Marlene, if there's any drill down on the statistics that you were showing around time unemployed versus age groups, and is there more in there about the types of jobs that people were looking for, professional versus entry level, professional versus trade? You know, we know that looking for management positions takes longer. Even when you've got a good and functional job, it takes a long time to move to your next position, and there's a lot of alignment that needs to happen with that. And I can imagine if you're unemployed, then that makes all of that difficult because you're breaking off networks. But is there more in there? Yeah.
There's a whole bunch more in there, and of course I just gave you headlines today. But you can look across trades, occupational groupings and so on. And a lot of this data is publicly available on the ABS websites and so on, Department of Employment websites. Unfortunately, the story is about the same across the types of work. The other story is that a very distressing story about underemployment, and you know, sometimes if you're employed you might be working 1 hour a week, so there's a whole untold story there about underemployment. It would be nice if I could say to you that, you know, positions and jobs in this particular stream were doing a whole lot better than positions in these streams. Unfortunately that's not the case. It's a pretty consistent picture.
That I wanted to follow up, which is around employment, is I was interested in the kind of employment that older adults were looking for after they had left the job. So, e.g., I'm the Secretary General, am I looking for the same kind of job when I'm 65? And am I prepared to look for a job that's lesser to my qualifications? And I think that's a very important question. And I'm a woman too. So how does that go?
From our work with older people and from all of the research we did, people are, of course, open to a whole range of new opportunities. Initially, often people start to apply for jobs in the areas that they know they've got a wealth of experience in. They've spent 30 years in that field or 20 years in this field. And so they think naturally they're going to be competitive in those fields. Unfortunately, that doesn't result.
Can I just ask you then, you said an interesting thing. They're not competitive. Now, I'm going to come back and say, really? So I've got 30 years experience. Who says I'm not competitive?
The decision makers.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Why are the decision makers determining that I'm not competitive? And it could come back to this point of, perhaps I'm going to have health issues, perhaps
Absolutely.
I've got family issues, so there seems to be a bit of discrimination, because I'm not able to ask my staff whether they intend to get married and have children, but it's okay for a potential employer
Indeed.
to determine from my that's correct?
I think that goes on quite a lot. So I think that the assumption is, if you've been working for a long period of time in a particular field and you come into the same sort of field, the assumptions that are being made about you is that your skills are outdated, you won't be very flexible, you might not be the right fit within this organisation, we don't really want to retrain you into the new modern ways we do things around here. All of those kinds of assumptions are being made about you. Particularly if you're a woman, there will be assumptions made about you. And it's interesting that the forms of discrimination against men and women in that one situation are quite different. It's often assumed that women will have outdated skills, that they will not perform as productively as a male counterpart. So there are a whole range of gender impacts there.
Okay.
There are judgments about appearance and so on.
Okay, let's go back to the floor. Yep, hi.
Hi,
Hi, Mark.
I'm Jane. Mark Teal from Council on the Ageing. In acknowledging the absolute importance of evidence and data in understanding and then moving forward, it seems to be that if we look, say, at demographics and sort of age brackets, we go 55, 59, 60, 64, 65 plus. And that seems to be lumping a whole large group of very diverse age groups and people into one sort of, one amorphous group. Is that a fair observation? And if it is, how do we start to, I guess, really push for a deeper analysis of that sort of 65 plus age group?
Look, the answer is yes, and it's a global phenomenon. And from the highest level, you know, the WHO action plan actually specifically states the deaggregation. And it's the deaggregation all the way through to 90 plus, so with 5-year brackets. But it's experienced across the world, and also gender. You know, once you get to 75 in some countries, you seem to be gender neutral. So that's, I'm sure that this issue is being considered, but I think it comes back to academics also that are at the pointy end of their methodology. So, Loretta, did you want to make a comment about that?
Well, I thought you made a very important comment in your talk, not sure if you did today, maybe last night, about how who is considered old depends really so much on culture. And was it Somalia where the age expectancy is?
37.
37, so that's not in our old bracket. I know gerontologists in the literature talk about young old and old, but I also think that's not ideal because functionality, which is your point again, knows no age boundaries. Yeah.
I'd like to have a conversation about age without age being in the conversation. You know, that's my ultimate. Christine and then Marlene.
Just very quickly too, that a lot of us have began to look at that age cohort. It is about looking, I guess, across the spectrum. So it is looking at 55 plus when you understand the demographics of your local communities and trying to get a handle on, you know, what's going to be important to them, what's currently important to them, what do they value, what are their aspirations, because we can't be planning around communities without considering, you know, the people that are continuing to age as well.
And I think, you know, I was profoundly moved by the Welcome to Country this morning, but we haven't mentioned Indigenous people, you know, as a very important group. So average life expectancy is as well as migrant populations. So Marlene, and then questions?
The only other point I wanted to make in response to you, Mark, was that I agree there is this amorphous lump after 65, and that wherever we can, we should make efforts to segment the data that we have. But the people that I see who are leading this charge and really understand this, and it's because of the economic clout and purchasing power of older people, is business. They are serious, getting much, much more serious about segmenting their markets, understanding the difference between 65-year-olds and 75-year-olds and 85-year-olds and so on, as you say, even to 5-year age groups, so that they can push products and services. And they are really leading the charge in this because they get it.
You know, they're leading the charge to get the market. They're not leading the charge to be any different to that market. And I think they're two different things.
But in terms of gathering that data.
Yes, but perhaps we can actually turn it around the other side and say, you've got the data, start actually understanding your market from a relationship perspective. So, yes, thank you.
Carol Lambert, I'm from the town of Cambridge. Oh, thank you. I've heard a lot today about the need to understand our communities and the specific needs of seniors or over 55s or people that we're trying to assist and research. We're just about to embark on an age-friendly communities plan, and I'm concerned about how to engage best with some of those people. It's unlikely that many of them are going to come out of their homes to a public forum. So can you give us some suggestions on how best to engage with older people to really do find out about what their needs are? Thank you.
Okay, well, I've certainly got some ideas, but I'll go to Christine first.
Look, there'd be a wealth of experience in this room, so I'd certainly encourage you in the lunch break to mingle with lots of people from other local governments. I'll speak just very quickly to a couple of ways that I know we've tried to do that. We've looked at when we tried to encourage people who I guess are those hard to reach, that perhaps are more isolated. We've looked at people who receive Meals on Wheels in their own homes and ways of working with that service provider to engage with that group. Likewise, I think there's lots of opportunity with any service providers that are going into people's homes to deliver healthcare or support services, to be working with those people, involving them in your process of gathering information about people. I think the other part in local government land is that in WA, as all of you here would know, we are required by legislation to do community planning. And community planning is really that high level engagement again with our community about aspirations or what people value. And certainly I think we need to be looking at that umbrella high level work as we do the age friendly community engagement work as well, because that can tell us lots of things that inform some of that work as well.
Okay. I'm always intrigued by supermarkets. And, you know, I'd like to sort of think about where do older people go? What do they need to do? They need to go to the supermarket. Can we engage with the supermarket chain to actually have some kind of gathering? Do you know, I went to the Spud Shed for the first time. That was entertaining. I mean, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of people of all ages. However, so I think Christine's comment about mingle, put your hand up, show everybody who you are so that you can mingle. But, you know, I think we also need to think about where do older people actually have to go so that you can, you know, create some opportunities. So, other questions? One here. Okay, one, 2 and 3. Yes, please.
Hello, my name's Sharon Parcell. My current business is Talent Consortium. I'm here today in my capacity with South Perth Senior Citizen Centre. In a former career, I was a GM here for one of the big corporate recruitment firms, and I just wanted to address that. In that, lazier recruitment firms will take a brief from a client and the client pays. So the client, you find that a path of least resistance to deliver what the client wants. A good recruitment consultant will push the brief and broaden the spectrum of that, but it just really depends on that training both sides. One of the things I wanted to put forward too, and I'm not a great favour of agendas or quotas, but we're in an age, if you like, of looking at female quota, certainly on our boards, etc. So maybe there's an opportunity within this room, within government and local government, to put a quota or an agenda and employ themselves. The people within this cohort is one of the suggestions I'm sort of putting out there, but I'd be more than happy to work with you around that sort of brief. And also the context of work is a challenging one as the future of work is automated, and not only this sector and this group of people, but the moderate generations are also going to be impacted by automation in work. So it's a bigger piece than just siloing this place at the moment. So probably more of a commentary, but very keen on talking to you, Marlene, about how I can assist there.
It's interesting though, because last evening one of the questions was around, from a gentleman who said, I'm retired, I don't need to work, but I actually thought, perhaps I'll be an Uber driver, because that will then, you know, I like talking to people and I like being out, but then I worry about the younger Uber driver. And he was talking about this tension, and it strikes me that I may not be particularly wanting paid work, but I do want to contribute. So it may not be employment per se, but it may be how can I contribute. But thank you, and I'm sure that there'll be people.
Thank you. My name is Karen White. I'm from WA Local Government Association. I work with several local governments, and my specific field is road safety, and within the WA strategy, part of that is the transportation and public transport. Well, I'm quite interested because transportation has come up on several of your slides, and I see it perhaps as an important issue from what you're saying, people being able to get to work, people being able to go out socially, and also for various services that they require. With WA being sort of perhaps harder to access in certain areas because of the long distances that people have to travel for each of those issues, transportation is quite important. A couple of you have actually spoken about what you've looked at globally. My question is, have you seen anything globally where transportation has been addressed? Any specific programs that have been successful in that field?
Okay, I can have a go at it, but do you want to?
There's a interagency state age-friendly communities group, and over the last period of time, and that's a group that has representatives from several different government departments, and I sit on that group representing local government, and we had a focus on transport, and a really interesting pilot and I guess attempt in the wheat belt was around trying to utilise school buses after they'd done school runs to be able to be available to take older people into towns for medical appointment, for shopping. That was quite, and that was really led by the Wheat Belt Development Commission. And I understand they had a lot of issues, you know, things like a lot of barriers around insurance, those sorts of obstacles. But I guess people are trying to think, particularly in the WA context, about the distance and how can we utilise existing assets that we have in our communities. I think you'd find in the metropolitan area, most local governments who do the age-friendly communities work, I'd imagine one of the priorities is transport. I just look around the room, people nodding. It's certainly one of our priorities that older people have said are important to them. And it's not as you would know, it's not a quick fix because everyone is so different. That some people want a bus to be able to come on a regular basis to take them to a shopping centre. Other people want to be able to, contact more immediate transport needs like an Uber that's affordable. So it's a very complex, challenge.
Okay, any other comment?
Can I just take it from a slightly different perspective as an employment opportunity? Because I'm reminded of a bus company, Forest Coach Lines in Victoria, that has a large cohort of their drivers are second career. They've done other things, but they've wanted flexibility. They've wanted to work shorter hours, so they themselves are driving the buses for people in the community for various purposes and loving it. And the organisation is supporting them ergonomically. There's, in terms of maintaining their health, their connections and so on. So it's an interesting way of looking at that issue, but from an employment perspective.
And I think also that, as Christine said, it's complex, there's no one size fits all, and there's going to need to be different kinds. Internationally, community groups will set up their own system. The school bus, that's been tried. I would be intrigued to see whether Uber would be interested in negotiating some kind of idea, some deal. I know in Canada they have in a city where hospital transportation was very costly, and so some contract has been made with Uber that's very, very successful. So I think we need to think beyond what we've got now. Question. Thank you. We've got 5 more minutes for questions, so Keep them coming. Yes, sir.
I'm Frank Smith. I'm one of the working old. I'm planning to retire when I'm 80. I want to draw your attention to government disincentives to work for older people. First of all, Centrelink knocked 50% off your pension for everything you earn as a self-employed person, and I suggest that self-employed is the way to go for most older people. You have no access to super, or you can't put money into super, and there's also problems with workers' compensation. Those things discourage older people from taking up the sort of part-time work which makes life fun.
Yes. So we acknowledge this. What can we do about it? This is a fact that Australians live with. And it seems to be, if we look at the demographics and the labour market, etc., it seems to be out of sync, doesn't it? It does seem to be out of sync because retirement age, whatever that is increasing. So it seems to be out of sync. So, it's a tricky one. I mean, is it a battle that we want to fight? I think that's the first thing. Is it a battle that we're likely to win? So I think we need to sort of think about, while it's a fact and while it seems to be against the trends, particularly overseas, what can we do about it? Is it a conversation we need to, is that the answer? So perhaps an action is that we start having the conversation about the fact that the de-incentivisation of older workers seems to be, not in sync with the trends. So perhaps that could be an action. And your Have a Go news, start writing about it. Okay, next question.
Yes, Ephraim Osaga, also professional bridge. I think Professor Loretta already identified the fact that a set of people were missed from your research, which talking about inclusion. I'll be keen to hear how you intend to avoid that for your next survey. And also, there's been so much talk about equity, just beyond equality. Sometimes you have to do a little bit more to include some people. So I'll also be keen to hear from the panelists, even Marlene and Christine. Are you considering some form of quota system or affirmative actions just to make sure we don't miss this out all over again? Otherwise, I think it will happen again.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir. I'm taking two because then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. Rob Thomas, Town of Cottesloe. There are some employers who seem to be keen to employ older people, and Bunnings is one of them. And I'm wondering, how can we get that message across to other employers and take the case to them of Bunnings and say, well, look at what Bunnings have achieved, look at the results they're getting, why aren't you doing it?
Wouldn't it be great to have the Chamber of Commerce sponsor a summit on age-friendly business, and we have the champions lined up and they present their business case? Yes. So why don't, perhaps, is it worthwhile putting that down as an idea that the organisers take away and think about? Because I'm convinced, like you are, that if the snowball starts running down the hill, then we're really going to create change. So, could it be done? Of course it could. We'll make it happen. Thank you. Right, Rebecca. Cecilia, I'm wanting to make sure that we get this man's question answered up. No, the one that just answered up the back. But if you wanted to make a comment. No, did you want to make a comment?
Sorry, it was just in relation to transport. In a former life, I ran a not-for-profit and provided transport to elderly consumers. And there's next to no end questions asked on what the limitations are in regard to that. And your observation about like digging deeper, don't just look at the stats, look at the experience. And you know, the assistance equipment that elderly people use, like a walker, you can't get more than 10 on a bus. So suddenly your bus that should seat 30 now seats 10 or 15, and that becomes uneconomic to run. But nobody asks those questions, nobody looks that little bit deeper, and the fact that you can't put a walker on, you know, a Department of Transport bus, because if you're a larger person, they're a larger size, larger width, they don't go down the corridor. So it's just about, I think really there needs to be a lot more analysis on what's going on and how things are changing for people in order to solve some of the transport issues.
So perhaps there needs to be an ad hoc group that actually looks at this and comes with some recommendations.
Yep.
So finally, we'd like to, I'm sorry, we haven't got to you. So we're talking about equity and equality. Loretta, would you like to start off and just make your final comments as we go?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, and it links back to the question here about you know, getting adequate representation of diversity in the community. And diversity is, I think, a really complicated piece of this story. One of the things that happens with the model that we use with Age Friendly is you do your analysis and you get your numbers, and sometimes you're, of course, with limited resources, you tend to deal with the larger number segments of your community. But there are smaller groups that really do require, and I think this is what you were getting to about inclusivity and exclusion. You know, there's 1 million small clubs and associations that are organised by usually migrant group, cultural background. That's certainly an avenue, I think, along with Meals on Wheels, and I'm sure I know they're already utilised, but that's where I think you find those cultural brokers, those people who are competent as a bridge in both communities to facilitate the dialogue. Because another thing I'd like to say about culture, which is really important, is that we have very different understandings about what ageing is. And there is a very strong particular cultural understanding in the rhetorics of our policies, which is not necessarily the same as the ones in the communities. So for example, a previous study I did looked at what it means to age well, and every cultural group, there were 7, said to age well you wanted to be independent. What does it mean to be independent in ageing?
It's great. Academics are great. They don't listen. No signs.
Well, I'll just finish by saying, for the Italians, being independent in old age was being cared for by your family. For the Dutch, being independent in old age was being cared for by the state. They're radically oppositional perspectives. So the state goes in and asks, how do you age well?
Loretta,
and you could come up against it.
All right, okay.
I'm going to be really brief. I endorse all of that. My only thing in terms of being inclusive would be that when you're working with other communities, be prepared to do things differently. Do not go in and think you know and impose. My final comments in terms of a lot of the ideas that have come up here in terms of employment targets, quotas, showcases, bringing business of Chambers of Commerce, Australian Industry Group and so on, those initiatives are happening. Tap in, there's a lot of goodwill there. You can make something really good happen here in Perth.
Great. Christine.
Finally, so from, I guess, the local government perspective, we should have that understanding before we start our planning of who's in our community. So we should be able to say we're not hearing from this particular group that might be a minority group from a particular culture, and then we look at ways of being able to engage. And as people have said, that's really about going to them. It's not about expecting them to come to us. It's about looking at who's already got those relationships and piggybacking on those relationships into that. There's been some fabulous different examples. I know the City of Fremantle a while ago did an engagement process with Indigenous elders, which was actually art-based workshops, which at each of those art-based workshops, they got to talk about a particular domain. so that they're able to gather the information that way. And finally, I'll just finish that we changed, I think, a bit of the way where I work. We had an access and inclusion officer, which is quite common in local government, or disability access and inclusion officer. We changed that role to be a social justice advocate, and it shifted the whole way that I think we look at that work, that it is around equity and it's around social justice, which has given it, I guess, a far more powerful position in how it responds.
Thank you. Can you all put your hands together for the panel? Thank you.